Welcome to video number 3 on environmental factors. As always, we will look at the learning objectives, what the overarching message is, and what, in our opinion, are the 5 most important topics for this chapter. As always, we encourage you to read the entire chapter. In this particular instance, we actually encourage you to read it twice because chapter 3, environmental factors, is quite an important one. So, what is the message? As you will see going through the entire curriculum, a lot of topics come up again and again, and many are interconnected. And the same is true for this chapter. Environmental factors are in the center of a lot of chapters. This is also the reason why we say you have to have a decent understanding of things like the donut economics or Stockholm Resilience Center's 9 planetary boundaries. Which those show the environmental challenges that we as a society face. Because chapter 3 builds a lot on that understanding. Now, when it comes to climate change, there are 2 important concepts: climate change mitigation and climate change adaptation. Very broadly speaking, mitigation talks about the transitory risks that will happen over the coming years. Think of things like insurance prices increasing for homes that are near the coastlines, or firms that are hit by stricter regulation when it comes to how they operate. The carbon emissions, the use of energy, and stuff like that. Carbon taxes may be introduced as one mechanism to curtail the contribution to pollution. These are all mitigation risks. And on the other side of the spectrum are adaptation issues. And adaptation is how firms are exposed to climate risks today. Hurricanes, droughts, wildfires, these are all happening as we speak. How are firms exposed to these risks? Where are their production facilities? Are they located in areas where wildfires have become more severe year over year? Has the location that they operate in got hit by more and more hurricanes with a much stronger severity, maybe one that previously was only seen every 100 years? Adaptation deals with the solution to issues that are happening today. Opportunities in that area are firms who may produce hurricane-proof windows, for instance. Things like protecting the coastline, developing drought-resistant crops today. These are all opportunities coming out of this adapting to the physical climate risks that we are faced with today. So this chapter talks a lot about who the largest emitters are of greenhouse gases, what the effect is, for instance, the melting of permafrost, the dieback of the Amazonas, and then as a continuation of this discussion is what are the socio-economic impacts of climate change? What's the impact on livability, workability, food systems, food security, impact on physical assets and infrastructure, natural capital? The chapter makes a quite good job in providing the candidate with an understanding of how broad the environmental issue is. We hear a lot about climate change, but it's often difficult to understand what that means exactly. This is why it's good that the chapter goes into sub-areas and explains, the impacts on natural resources, biodiversity loss, land use and forestry, marine resources, pollution, waste management, water management. It also introduces the topic of circular economy, which is the approach to move away from producing goods for one-time use to think about a way to reuse the raw material as well as the produced goods several times before disposing of them. In that sense, it draws the relationship between business activities and environmental issues. A big factor in regards to business activities is to look at the supply chain. The chapter lists some of the sectors with particularly high risk supply chains like oil and gas, mining, beef production, cocoa production, and cotton. Another important section is the key trends influencing companies today. In that chapter, the growth in environmental policies are explained. This then introduces the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change that got established in 1992. Following that are the Kyoto Protocols that were introduced in 2005. That protocol was the first convention that set targets for emission of main greenhouse gases like CO2, methane, and others. Then following the Kyoto Protocol came the Paris Agreement in 2015, which set the specific targets to keep the increase in global average temperatures well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, and to limit the increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius. This would substantially then reduce the effects of climate change. The chapter also touches on the important advancements done in Europe with the introduction of the EU taxonomy, the Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, or short SFDR, which aim to provide more transparency around financial instruments and their adoption of climate measures in an attempt to combat greenwashing. The chapter compares the EU's efforts with those of other countries, including the US, China, India, Japan, Australia. It also introduces the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, or short TCFD, which is an international framework for disclosure of climate change risks and opportunities affecting companies and financial institutions. G20 finance ministers and central bank governors set out to provide a set of recommendations and the framework for companies and financial institutions to provide better information to support investors, lenders, insurers, to quantify climate-related risks and opportunities. The chapter then further tries to explain how to analyze climate risk. This introduces the metric of carbon risk premium. There are several levels by which climate risks can be analyzed: company, sector, country, and market level. And then the question is, how can carbon risks be measured? One way is by looking at the carbon footprinting, and there are several levels. There are 3 levels actually, which are Scope 1, 2, and 3. Scope 1, in essence, are the emissions that refer to fuel, combustion, company vehicles, and fugitive emissions. Scope 2 are purchased electricity, heat, and steam. And then Scope 3 are purchased goods and services, business travel, employee commuting, waste disposal, use of sold products, transportation and distribution, investments and leases, assets, and franchises. So Scope 3 is quite rarely disclosed by companies because it is the most difficult to track. How do you track your employee commute, or the use of the products that you sell? It's very difficult to do that, and it's also quite difficult to avoid double counting in that tracking. Yet, it's the most meaningful of the 3 scopes. It's the highest of the 3 scopes. But again, it's the one that's least disclosed. Companies tend to use 2 ways to report the carbon footprinting. One is by showing the total carbon emissions, which is the current value of the investment divided by the issuer's market capitalization. So we're looking at the portfolio level here. So current value of the investment, your investment, divided by the total by the issuer's market capitalization times the issuer's Scope 1 and 2 emissions. The other way is the weighted carbon emission metric, which is the current value of the investment, again in your portfolio, times the issuer's Scope 1 and 2 emissions over the issuer's revenue in $1 million. In the same kind of context, the chapter talks about net zero targets and science-based targets, which are disclosed strategies by companies to achieve the Paris-aligned goal to reach net zero greenhouse gas emissions by 2050. With all this data available, the question then becomes how to apply it into a portfolio, how to factor climate risks into a company valuation. The chapter shows how specific environmental risks may impact company risks. For example, air or water pollution produced by a company may expose the company to risks of tighter regulation, which then may lead to asset write-offs or additional capital expenditures should the company have to abandon this operation or make substantial investments to adjust to the new regulation. The chapter also talks about how companies may benefit from opportunities that arise from climate change. Those are the things like circular economy, clean and technological innovation, green and ESG related products, and the blue economy. These are all structural themes that companies may find products to solve for. So you see, this chapter, compared to chapter 2 or chapter 1, has much more meat on its bones. Be sure to understand where all starts. The issue that our planet is facing, is facing challenges on many fronts: melting of permafrost, biodiversity loss, air and water pollution. This has put us on a trajectory to a fast warming of the planet, which can have devastating impacts and ripple effects beyond what we can grasp today. This is why numerous regulations and policies are in the making, increasing the financial risk for companies. In addition, the immediate impact of climate change, the physical risks, are impacting our infrastructure and real estate already in a very real way today. In an effort to better understand these climate risks, companies are asked to disclose, their exposures and their greenhouse gas emissions. This will then allow the analysts to better understand the risks that are connected to their investment in a company. But climate change does not only bring risks, it also brings opportunities. Some structural trends are growing at a fast pace and need a solution. This is where very innovative companies can rise and shine. Now, with regards to our next section here, the environmental, the most important topics. Again, this is such an important chapter that I would actually encourage you to read it twice. But if we had to point to the 5 most important topics, it would probably be climate change, mitigation, and adaptation. Understand the differences of those two concepts. Supply chain, who are the worst polluters, and that kind of discussion. History of the convention, Kyoto Protocol, Paris Agreement. Analyzing climate risks, and then implementing climate risks in your investment framework.